The Jets will open the 2024 season in a primetime blockbuster, and their first-round pick signs on time. Let's break it down today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, May 14th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and you're listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. We have quite a bit of news to break down for a Tuesday in May. The NFL announces the first game of the Jets 2024 season. The rest of the schedule comes out tomorrow, but the league has been announcing some of the marquee games, the teams that will play, the dates, and the time. And for the second straight year, the Jets will begin their season on Monday Night Football. This time it's on the road. They will be visiting the defending NFC Champion San Francisco 49ers. The league, in its quest to monopolize the full 12 months of the calendar, at this point in May, tries to turn their schedule release into a hyped event. Tomorrow night's the main course where we find out the rest of the Jets games. But we now know the Jets will open their season in San Francisco against the 49ers. Of course, they opened their season Monday night in 2023. It was a very memorable game against the Buffalo Bills. The Jets won an overtime thriller, but the win came at a cost because the Jets lost their starting quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, for the full season. Jets are hoping for a similar fate in terms of how the game turns out. The Jets want to start their season with another win. They're certainly hoping they don't deal with another injury as major as Rodgers in this game. Jets have also opened their season in San Francisco in the past. If you go back 26 years, the Jets began the 1998 season in San Francisco. They lost an overtime thriller that day to the 49ers. Garrison Hurst, 49ers running back, a quality player through much of his career, played a number of years with the Cardinals, then moved to the San Francisco 49ers. In that game in 1998, which was a shootout between Glenn Foley, who was the Jets quarterback, and Steve Young, the Hall of Fame 49ers quarterback, game was decided on a 96-yard touchdown run by Hurst in overtime. So the Jets lost. Jets had pinned the 49ers deep on a punt in overtime, and then Hurst broke that 96-yard run to win it. Jets lost that game, but they went on to have a great season. They ended up going 12-4 and went to the AFC Championship game that year. So, some good and some bad omens from the Jets opening their season in San Francisco. Now, I think there's no question about it. This is a difficult test. This is going to be a difficult way for the Jets to start their 2024 season. Is it good or bad to play the 49ers this early? The thing about the schedule release is they're only telling you the dates and times of these games. It's not a surprise that the Jets have to go to San Francisco. We knew that already. We know all 17 opponents. We know whether the Jets are going to be home or away against all 17 opponents. It's just a question of the dates and times of these games. Is it good to be week one in San Francisco? I think part of the challenge with the schedule release, the NFL, again, trying to monopolize the full calendar. So this is what they've come up with in the month of May, is they try and turn the schedule release into this major event. The challenge with it, though, is it's kind of difficult to analyze whether or not it's good or bad because there are so many unknowns looking into the future. You don't know. In the NFL, typically half the playoff teams turn over from year to year. So you don't really know who's going to be good and who's going to be bad. Now, I think we can guess that the 49ers are probably going to be good, but you don't know. Sometimes a team that's supposed to be good runs into a lot of key injuries, like the Bengals last year. There are lots of, the Jets last year. The Jets were supposed to be good last year. They had a lot of injuries. I think a lot of teams heading into 2023 marked the Jets as a tough opponent. And for the most part, they ended up not being a tough opponent. So you don't know. It could be a situation where the 49ers are supposed to be good and they have a year like they had in 2020, where that was the last time they were coming off a Super Bowl berth and they suffered a million injuries. And, maybe it would have been better to get them later that season. You're getting them early guarantees that, you're probably going to have most of their good players in the lineup. Even if the 49ers don't have a great season, you expect it's going to be a tough game week one. That said, I think there are some benefits to the Jets to playing the San Francisco 49ers this early. I think number one, this is not a game anybody's really expecting the Jets to win. So, typically people are very stressed week one because, you want to get your season off to a good start. But heading out to the Bay in California week one, it's a game the 49ers are going to be favored in. And on paper, again, we don't know how good the 49ers are going to be this year, but you expect that they're going to be a pretty tough team. And on paper, this is going to be one of the toughest games the Jets play. So if you lose, well, it's not really a game anybody was expecting to win anyway. If you win, then you have what might be one of your toughest opponents in the rearview mirror, and you've already banked a win. It could be a way to get your season off to a good start. I think another thing that benefits the Jets is to the extent it's good to have your toughest games in the early part of the season, especially week one. Week one's like the weirdest week. Week one is a week where weird results happen every single year. I mean, in the Brady era, the Patriots, who were such a dominant team, half of their Super Bowl seasons, they lost week one. So they're just some bizarre results. Teams have extra time to prepare for opponents. Players aren't always in game condition because of how infrequently the top guys play in the preseason. So sometimes you get guys who are really tired by the second half. Sometimes just weird results happen. There's an old saying by Charles Barkley, who's, the Hall of Fame basketball player who's now an NBA analyst on TNT. He says something like, in the early part of the season, the bad teams don't realize they're bad. So you could be playing with confidence. A good example of this was last year, the Jets beating the Bills week one. I think we all know that without Aaron Rodgers, at least, the Jets were a far inferior team to Buffalo, and they played almost that entire game without Aaron Rodgers. But the Jets were able to beat them. They played later in the season in Buffalo. The Bills crushed the Jets because the Bills were the better team. So sometimes you get fluky results week one. And there's also, again, you get to prepare. Kyle Shanahan has a lot of tricks up his sleeve typically. Well, there's probably no defensive coach who understands how Shanahan thinks better than Robert Saleh. And now Saleh gets extra time to prepare. If you're going to, when you're facing your toughest opponent, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have, not to have more than 1 week to get ready for it. I'm not going to say the Jets are going to spend their entire training camp preparing for San Francisco, but obviously your first game, you have extra time to think things through, to come up with your game plan, to make sure it's a top-notch game plan. So, these are, I think in many ways, this is a positive for the Jets to start their season off early. Now, the negatives, one, it's a tough test. Obviously, it's a tough way to start your season going on the road, week one. Number two, you have that short week two. So if you lose that game, as I mentioned, nobody's really expecting you to win, but a loss isn't the end of the world. But if you lose that game, week two becomes pretty important, and you have a short week heading into that. And you hope that the Jets will be home after a short week and a long trip. We don't know where their week two opponent at the time they're recording this podcast, but that could be a challenge. Another big challenge I see is that while the Jets' offensive line has a lot of quality pieces on paper, we need to be honest. It's pretty much a new offensive line. When you compare the week one offensive line for 2023 versus the week one offensive line for 2024, 4 new starters. And that's a good thing. They needed 4 new starters. But it takes time. Offensive lines need chemistry. It takes time to, for them to really click. And the first couple of weeks, even in the good offensive line, even when the individual pieces are really talented, it can be a challenge because you're still getting used to playing with the guys who are next to you. And the 49ers are a tough pass rush. And that's a tough pass rush to face for what's essentially a new offensive line, because when you have 4 new starters, that means none of the 5 guys played next to each other the previous season. AVT, Elijah Vera Tucker is back. He's returning from injury, but he doesn't really have a lot of experience playing next to the guys who are near him. I mean, he played with Tippmann a little bit last year. He didn't really play with Morgan Moses, even though they were teammates in 2021, because they played on different sides of the line. So a new offensive line trying to break it in against this pass rush, that's tough. But I think that I think there's a lot to be taken that's positive. And then there are things we don't know. It's possible, the 49ers could have like the 1 seed clinched late in the season. And if that's the case, maybe you'd rather play them week 17 because they'd rest their starters. Or it's possible they could be going for 1 seed and really focusing on going all out. Or it's possible, they could have a Super Bowl hangover this year and week 1's the good time to get them. There's just a lot we don't know. And that's one of the reasons I don't like to overanalyze. Look, there's obviously stuff to talk about with the schedule, but I think sometimes we overanalyze the schedule. These are the things I think we can say right now. I think there's some good and some bad. And at the end of the day, I kind of feel like I like this opponent week 1 for the positives I laid out. First of all, take some of the pressure off the week 1 performance because you're not expecting to win anyway. And I think the extra time for what on paper is one of your best opponents is a positive thing for the New York Jets. Speaking of positives, we're not going to have a first round holdout this year. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about Olu Fashanu agreeing to terms with the Jets on his rookie contract. We avoid some of the ugliness we've had with past Jets first round picks. That's ahead here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by GameTime. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, GameTime takes the guesswork out of buying NFL tickets. They have last-minute deals. You can save up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets for sports, comedy, theater, concerts, you name it. And you can save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or event. You save even more when you choose a section and let GameTime choose the seats. They have all-in pricing. Toggling this feature shows you the total upfront with no surprise fees at checkout. And you can get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy, so you know exactly what you're walking into. No unpleasant surprises like some sort of column in front of you when you arrive at your seat. You already know what you're getting into. GameTime's a great app for buying NFL tickets. A great buy for buying any kinds of tickets. I've used it many times myself. Super easy to use. Just pull out your phone or mobile device. Yeah. Open the app, a couple clicks, and you've got great seats at an amazing price. You know, you want to go see the Knicks or Rangers as their playoff runs continue. GameTime's the place to do it. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. It's LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download the GameTime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And if you're a fan of Locked On Jets, check out Locked On Sports Today. You might be tired of hearing all the screaming from Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV. Well, that's where Locked On Sports Today comes in. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, we talked about the Jets opening their season in San Francisco. Olu Fashanu is going to be there, the first-round pick. There will be no first-round holdout for the Jets this season, and I frequently, through the years, have referred to getting your first-round pick signed on time for training camp as kind of like a paint-by-numbers thing. It used to be more challenging before 2011. That's when the current rookie wage scale came in, which essentially sets the contract terms for all of your rookies. And there's the occasional holdout. You know, the Chargers dealt with Joey Bosa many years ago. The Bears had a holdout situation with Roquan Smith, but they tend to be very rare, or at least for 31 of the 32 teams. There's been one team that's had a lot of issues getting their first-round picks into training camp on time since the rookie wage scale came into effect. And that started in 2013 with Dee Milner. John Idzik was the GM then. It continued into 2018 with Sam Darnold. A year later, Quinnen Williams, 2019. 2021, Zach Wilson was not in camp on time for the Jets. And you may notice that there's a trend there. There's a different GM every single, three of the four players, three different GMs. And to me, that suggests the issue's been ownership. Now, there are a few things that need to be negotiated when we're talking about the rookie contract. One of them is whether the player gets what's known as offsets. And offsets come into play if the player is cut. Essentially, what that means is that if the player is cut and signs with another team for a minimum contract, the Jets then are off the hook for whatever the minimum is. So the player he would never get a $1 contract, but every dollar another team pays the player after he's cut, that means the Jets don't have to pay that player that money, because these contracts are all guaranteed. So Jets cut a guy and he signs with another team for $1. That's $1 less the Jets need to pay the guy after they cut him. It's not really worth arguing over. I never thought like these offsets are worth drawing a line in the sand over, but the Jets have drawn a line in the sand over a lot of these offsets. And the reason it's not that important is that if a player has offsets, he's never going to sign for more than the league minimum, because it just doesn't make sense. The player makes the same amount of money either way. So he's going to sign with a new team for the league minimum. And the Jets would save a very, very small amount of money. The second reason the offsets aren't worth fighting over is that they almost never come into play. I mean, look at how poorly things went with Zach Wilson. He still wasn't cut. The Jets were still able to find a trade partner despite having a quarterback they drafted 2 overall, where things went as poorly as possible. He still wasn't cut, and offsets only come into play when the player's cut. But the Jets kept drawing the line in the sand over this. The second thing that can be negotiated are what's known as the bonus schedules. And essentially what the bonus schedules are, it's exactly what it sounds. Player gets a signing bonus. The question is, when does the team pay it out? The players typically want to be paid as soon as possible, because you want to have money today instead of having to wait for your money. Quinnen Williams, that was an issue. That was the reason Quinnen Williams was not signed in training camp on time. The Quinnen Williams that dealt with it was like a residency thing, because in the year 2019 he was a resident of Alabama, so he wanted to get the money immediately, because he was moving to New York, and New York taxes are higher, so he'd have to pay less taxes if he got the money the year he was an Alabama resident. these things are not worth fighting over. And the Jets have drawn a line in the sand, and they've done it with 3 different GMs. So that either tells me we have 3 GMs who are fighting battles that don't need to be fought, or more likely, ownership is like interfering with these contract negotiations in a way it should not be. And at the end of the day, like these contracts are so small now, it's almost like there's no reason to fight over these things. If the player, it means that much to the player, just give it to him, because the team makes out so well if a player is good. These contracts are such a great value for these teams if the player is good, that like some offset thing, it's not going to do it. It's not going to do anything for you, like winning on like offsets or winning on like these bonus payment schedules. These are such small victories, and it's not like, not like the rest of the league is going to be put on notice. Not like agents are going to be put on notice. Wow, the Jets really dug in their heels on the offsets. We know that they're going to be tough negotiators. It doesn't work out that way. So I'm glad that the Jets have finally, over the last couple of years, gotten these contracts done early and not like dug in their heels over these very, very minor issues. I mean, the fact that like players could hold out as first round picks these days, and there can be such acrimony between these teams and these agents negotiating these deals. What it says to me is almost like, if you get people with big enough egos in a room, they will find a way to like fight over the smallest issue. And I'm just glad, the last couple of years, the Jets have gotten these contracts done early. And this was one thing that I have been frustrated with the GMs over is, you have 3 months to get your player signed before the start of training camp. And for the Jets, it felt like a lot of these deals a lot of these like first round picks only got signed at the last minute, even when they were in training camp on time. Back in 2016, Darren Lee like went down to the day before training camp before the Jets actually signed him. It's like, why are you waiting until July to do this? You can do it at any point. Just get it done early. And if there are big issues, if you really do need to go negotiate these offsets, or if you do need to negotiate these bonus schedules, and there are a couple other things that could come into play, do it. Start the negotiation early. Just hammer these things out well before training camp, so you don't have to worry about these things. Because getting Olu-Fashanu into training camp on time, it's significant. Now, if he misses, if your first round pick misses a day or two, it's not going to put them that far behind. But you just don't want to have to worry about it. It's one thing. It's distraction you don't need. You get your first round pick the maximum number of practices, and I think it's important for Olu-Fashanu to get into training camp because Jets coaching staff wants to work with him, and just as significantly, you want him to follow Tyron Smith around. You want this guy learning from Tyron Smith. This is a real opportunity for Olu-Fashanu this rookie season, because he's going to have an opportunity to sit under and work with maybe the best left tackle of this generation in Tyron Smith. And that can, I don't want to overstate how significant it is, because, going back to last year, we heard a lot of this stuff about Aaron Rodgers, how Aaron Rodgers was going to teach Zach Wilson how to play. It's not the type of thing where if you're going to be bad, it's going to turn you into a good player. But it's the type of thing it can like help you improve more quickly. If Olu-Fashanu is going to be a good player, he may learn like some of the techniques on studying film from Tyron Smith, or how to train in the weight room. Just these little nuggets of information, or like things to watch for tells defensive ends have, like when they're trying to rush the passer. Just like little things like that might make his development quicker than it would otherwise be. So thankfully, we've an organization that has really messed up one of the easiest things to do in the sport for years. Seems like it's finally learning its lesson. It seems like we're improving here, because the last couple of years with the Jets, these contract negotiations have been nowhere near as acrimonious as they had been in the past. So I'm glad to see the Jets, finally getting their first round picks in camp on time. It should be a given. And fortunately, since the Zach Wilson fiasco a couple of years ago, it's starting to become a given. So good job, Jets. Way to get Olu-Fashanu in training camp on time. That was one piece of business the Jets needed to deal with. They had you on the Locked On Jets podcast. We'll talk about what else they might be looking at. We're at the point of the offseason where most of the players are signed, but there's still a couple guys out there, and the Jets may have a couple needs that they look to address. We'll talk about what those needs are and players who could sign with them as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. And if you're a Knicks or Rangers fan right now, you might be a little nervous. I mean, look, I don't root for either team. I'll tell you, relax. I think both teams are still in pretty decent shape right now. But if you're nervous, well, FanDuel's a place where you don't have to be nervous, because, again, you get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So we can't guarantee the outcome of the Knicks and Rangers. But on FanDuel, again, $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That seems like a pretty good deal, doesn't it? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. Again, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We've talked about the Jets opening their season in San Francisco. We've talked about how their first-round offensive lineman Olu Fashanu will be there because he's not holding out, thankfully. Jets get Fashanu signed. Who else will be in a Jets uniform week 1 in San Francisco? Now, I think that there is an expectation the Jets are still going to make a lot of moves this offseason, and I'm not sure that's necessarily accurate. In fact, Joe Douglas gave an interview within the last 2 weeks where he talked about their situation. He talked about, they don't really have that much cap space to maneuver. Now, one move that could happen, one move I'm almost expecting is I think they're going to do something with Hassan Reddick's contract. I'm expecting Hassan Reddick to get a contract extension sometime soon. And if for no other reason, then the Jets gave up a third-round pick for Reddick. So I think it's tough to give up a third-round pick for a guy if he's only going to be a one-year rental. Now, it's also tough. I think that if they were going to do this, they probably should have worked it out at the time of the trade because Reddick knows that the Jets gave him a third-round pick for him, so Reddick can drive a hard bargain. But if that happens, it's very likely that the Jets will be able to create a little bit of extra cap space. But Douglas indicated that in that interview within the last 2 weeks that they're not going to be that active. And the team's really set. I've heard some people suggest the Jets need to go out and get another wide receiver. I just don't see that. I'm not sure they're going to go out and get another wide receiver. I mean, you've got Garrett Wilson and Mike Williams as your 1-2 punch. You just drafted Malachi Corley in the 3rd round. You may not like it. Aaron Rodgers likes Allen Lazard, though. You may not like Allen Lazard, but Aaron Rodgers does, which means Lazard's probably going to have a role on this team. And I feel like we've gone through this weird cycle with Lazard where last year people were way overrating him, where I kept hearing this guy is a good number 2 receiver, and he wasn't. I mean, people never should have said that. And now it's we have this idea Lazard can't even play in the NFL. And to be fair, Lazard looked like a lousy receiver Lazard did not look like an NFL receiver last year, but historically through his time in Green Bay, he's been a functional 3rd or 4th option. So I just don't see where the room is. I mean, I guess I wouldn't mind them taking a shot on Hunter Renfrow, but as a slot receiver, maybe a buy low candidate. But I just don't know. I don't think that the Jets really need a receiver because you also have to remember that your bottom couple spots really go for special teamers. Your last 2 receiver spots are guys you typically want to play on special teams. So I don't know if you bring in another veteran. I mean, that knocks Lazard down to the 5th receiver spot or knocks Corley down. I don't know you want Corley playing on coverage units on special teams. So I don't know that the Jets will go out and get another receiver. A spot where they could probably use some help is the defensive tackle spot. And we talked yesterday on the show about Javon Kinlaw and how much the Jets have invested in him. I think the Jets may like what they have at the defensive tackle spot. I mean, look, I'm not a huge Solomon Thomas fan, but I think the Jets like him better than I do. So I think the Jets, I'm worried about the defensive tackle spot for the Jets, to be honest with you, but I don't know that that's necessarily where they're going to make a move. The spot Douglas mentioned in his recent interview was the safety position. And there are some interesting names at the safety position. In fact, the guy who's interests me the most is Justin Simmons, who's still a free agent at the time we're recording this podcast. And he's been an All-Pro 3 straight years. He's been an All-Pro 4 out of 5 for the last 5 years. He's been second team All-Pro, and he's still available. And this is something I mention a lot. If you listen to this show every day, I talk about this a lot in the offseason, how it always feels like there's a good safety or 2 available once you get to May. It's not a position the league values that highly. And, at the beginning of the offseason, I mentioned this, that, I did not think the Jets should spend big at the safety position at the outset of free agency. And this is exactly why. Because there's a guy right now who's been an All-Pro for the last 5 years who's still available in the month of May. So wait for the market to come to you. You don't need to go out and set the market. You don't need to go out and reset the market by giving somebody a huge contract. Usually, safety, it's a buyer's market in the NFL. It's not viewed as a high value position. There aren't a ton of difference makers in the league at the spot. And now you have a guy who's a perfect example, a guy who is All-Pro so second team All-Pro for the last 5 seasons. So that means the last 5 seasons, 4 of them, he's been one of the top 5 safeties in the league, and he's still available right now. And the Jets have a little bit of cap space. Now, I don't think Simmons is going to settle for the league minimum, but he might be at the point where maybe he just takes a 1-year contract to reset his market. Now, I'm not overly worried about the Jets safety position right now because, frankly, the rest of the defense looks really good. It's not that I love the Jets safety position. It's just the rest of the defense looks really good. And I think they can get by with Tony Adams and Chuck Clark. Chuck Clark was a good player in Baltimore. Now he's coming off a serious injury. So there are the questions about, how well will he bounce back? How quickly can he bounce back? Tony Adams, if we're going to be honest, very up and down last season, but the Jets got by with him fine. And look, if your safety position needs to drive your defense, I'd be worried about having Clark and Adams. But in a situation where you have on paper a good defensive line, on paper a good linebacker group, on paper a great corner group, if you're good at every other spot, having great safeties isn't as important. Of course, if you gave me the choice, though, if you said these are your two options, John, you can have really good safeties, or you can have not so good safeties. I'm going to take really good safeties. And I think that, like, if the Jets rework Reddick, that could leave enough money for Justin Simmons. We'll see. I mean, it's going to be, and, you know, it's almost like one of those things where I wonder if it's overkill. Like, how much will a great safety really improve this defense? Because, first of all, you already have so many good pieces. Second of all, safety's not really a position that moves the needle that much, but if he's available and it's May, there's a logic to just trying to make that move. This is, that's the guy I have my eye on right now for the Jets, because if you're talking about positions where the starters look shaky, there aren't that many. I guess to the extent there's a spot where the starters look shaky, it's the safety position. I think there are spots where the Jets could use some more depth, but I don't know how many good depth players are available this time of year. Justin Simmons would be the one guy I have my eye on who, probably could improve this team to a degree. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow. We're going to talk about the NFL schedule. Our mailbag, which is normally Wednesday, is going to be pushed to later in the week because schedule releases tomorrow. We'll talk about what to look for. That's ahead on tomorrow's show. See you then.